Well, today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's a day we look back on the country's dark history of race relations and look at the issues as it stands today. On the surface, it looks like we've come a long way. After all, we have a black-first family. But to what extent does racism still exist? Well, if you look at who's locked up in our prisons and the poverty rate in the U.S., it appears to still be quite a problem. Listen to this professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University.
What you see now is young, especially black and Latino families, and it relates to that, just the growth of the poverty rates. As I said, in D.C., the poverty rates are astronomical.
So how far have we really come when it comes to race in the United States? To discuss, I'm joined by RT producers Gavina Garay and Rachel Kurzius. Welcome to the both of you. Great to see you in here. So the fact that we have a black president seems like pretty compelling evidence that we have come a long way in this country. Rachel, what do you think?
Well, I think that as far as role modeling goes for children of color, certainly seeing a black family in the White House is certainly progress. Whether that means that racial discrimination goes away, especially for people on the streets who aren't living in the White House, who are, say, living in cities or even towns, I think that you'll find that racial discrimination very much exists, as does other forms of discrimination.
Right. So the fact that we do have a black president represents some progress, definitely doesn't mean that it's not an issue today. I want to ask you, Gavino, I think race has become a very complicated issue these days, but it's really everywhere, even when it comes to hailing a cab. I know you told me a story related to this earlier.
Yeah, ultimately, like you were saying, when you come back to the president being black, I mean, today Pew Research just released a new fact saying that, you know, his rating has gone down even further. And but to mention the cab story, it's really interesting. I just moved to D.C. a few weeks ago, and I was talking to one of my friends, and she said to me, Gavino, go out there and try to get a cab. And I was like, well, why don't you do it? And she says to me, are you crazy? Like, I'm black, I can't get a cab. And I was like, wow. You're not serious, right? And so I had to go and get a cab because it was nighttime, because apparently there's this thing here in DC where if you're black, you might not get picked up by a cab. And so I'm just baffled by that. I'm not even white, I'm Latino. My father's Peruvian, my skin is white. It's a very mixed question for me and for anyone of ethnic background, but the fact is that, like, if you're black in DC, your chances of getting a cab are pretty low, I'd say. At nighttime.
Yeah, Rachel, what do you think about that right here in D.C., in the nation's capital?
So I got a little bit of background from a cab driver who is explaining his impetus. He explained to me that he does not pick up young African-American men on the street, particularly at night, and the reason he gave me was this. One time he did, in the northeast of D.C., pick up a group of 3 young African-American men, and they ultimately stole his car and beat him up and then ended up crashing the car. So this isn't to say, at least in my opinion, I don't think that everyone who is African-American is going to do that. Certainly not, to the contrary, but for this taxi driver, he was so shaken by the experience, by that one moment, that he was willing to engage in racial discrimination, even though he knew it was against the law and against the rules he signed as a cab driver, because of an experience he had faced. So I think that until we get past seeing entire groups of people based on one experience you've had, that racial discrimination, such as we've talked about with these cabs, will continue.
Oh, interesting. Sometimes popular culture really sheds a light on the way things are in our country today. What do you think when it comes to consumerism, the media, entertainment? Does it point to maybe some things in our race relations today, Rachel? What do you think?
Sure. Well, there's a very interesting example. Recently, Alexis Texas is a pornography star, and she recently came out saying that she refuses to have sex with black men in her videos. Now, a lot of people came out, and this created a lot of controversy. A lot of people came out saying, you know what, Alexis Texas, this makes you a racist. A lot of other people said, how does this make you how does this make her a racist? She just has a preference. She just, say, prefers white or Latino or Asian men to black men personally, But what we've found doing research is that another grand hypothesis for this is that the majority of her audience is white. And she fears that if she engages in interracial pornography, that a lot of her audience may be turned off, and therefore she won't be as valuable as a commodity or as able to make money at her job. And you know, other people have said also that interracial pornography plays very much on stereotypes about what it is like when people of different races have sex, and that it very much plays on these stereotypes, and as such is racist in itself. So the more it seems that we try and glean answers about race and racial discrimination, the more questions are raised.
Oh, very interesting. I want to ask you, Gavino, because we live in this post-9/11 world, and we've seen this rise of Islamophobia. Is that population here in the U.S. a new target for hate crimes and racial discrimination?
I mean, I think that's a very, very good question, especially bringing the topic back to the day that we're celebrating today, that the UN has announced that it's the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And ultimately, if you go back to the Iran-Contra scandal, here in the U.S., there were, you know, not necessarily the most welcoming of feelings towards Iranian Americans or perhaps Iranian refugees that were living in the United States. Now, let us keep in mind that you know, it's difficult to come and to live here in the States if you're from a different background that we're not familiar with. You know, I remember when I first moved here to the U.S., I was put in a sort of students for difficulties class who had trouble learning, and I had no trouble learning. I was just put in that class and sort of, you know, forced to be there. And I remember like saying to my parents and my teachers at the time, like, why am I here? And they were saying, oh, it's because you're different. And I had to sort of like fight my way out of there in my first few years here living in the United States, because I wasn't born and bred here, I guess, you know?
And then you grow up and your parents, and then everybody wants to be different, right?
I guess so, right?
Appreciate you both weighing in on this. That was RT producers Gavino Garai and Rachel Kurzius.